Bem-vindas e bem-vindos à segunda mesa redonda da Escola de Inverno de Sociologia Política Internacional. Welcome to the second roundtable of the IPS Winter School. This is a public event, and I think it's being webcast. Yes? Yes. Yes. So I'm happy to see all of you here tonight. And I hope there's people following us also on YouTube. Então é um prazer receber a todos vocês aqui hoje. Apesar do adiantado da hora, do adiantado do mês, não é isso? Da vida ainda não, né? Mas é um prazer, principalmente, receber nossos convidados para essa mesa de hoje. So it's a special pleasure actually to welcome our guests, our distinguished guests to the roundtable today. To my right, Professor Jef Huysmans from Queen Mary University of London. To my left, Professor Mike Shapiro from the University of Hawaii. And to my further left, Professor Doerthe Rosenow from Oxford Brookes University. Sorry, Doerthe, Oxford Brookes University in the UK. So they will be addressing a theme that we discussed previously, time, memory, amnesia, critical historiography in a post-colonial world. So you're welcome to intervene right after our guests give their opening addresses, and I wish you all for a very good discussion. So we will start with Jef Huysmans here to my right, then Doerthe will follow, and Mike will be closing with his observations. Okay, so welcome again. Thank you all, and Jef, up to you.
Thank you, João. Do I speak in the microphone? Yeah, because I can't hear very well here. It's good to be on the round table here. It is a long title with lots of things in it. So what I thought I would do is to speak from something that's called Deep History. And it's from a book by Shuyak and Smale, which is called Deep History, 2011. And I thought I'd just throw out some things they say, which I think speak to the theme, and then we can see where we go from there. Yeah. So deep history is an understanding, it's an intervention in how history has constructed, how we understand time in history when it starts and not starts, and so on. And to some extent, it's a very simple idea. It's that you go back, not through 4,000 before Christ or something, but you go back to 8 million years. So often the idea when humans and apes somehow started, well, they have the evidence, archaeological evidence, that they started separating in different lines. So you have a much longer time span with it. But within the deep history thing, there are some issues raised about temporality, time, and about what does it mean to do history, and what kind of history is being done, and how do we come to understand, the world, and what moves the world, and so on, through particular conceptions of history, which is also a form of doing history. So there's a methodological component to it. The starting point, so I'm just going to throw, there's much more going on in the deep history than what I will throw out, but I just thought I would throw into to talk a little bit about some of the things that they raise. The first thing they raise is about the concept of deep time, which basically simply means that there are certain times from which we start telling history. For example, in international relations, it's often the Westphalian kind of moment. The post-colonial and decolonial goes a bit further back very often when you do the world history from that sense. So it goes a bit back, I guess, to the 15th, maybe 14th century or something, 15th, 16th century in the way. Yeah. So there are points, and you can see that the deep history goes way back to it. They also, of course, start making claims about how we should not think in terms of origin and then move into the end. But one of the elements is that the starting point is important for the history that's being constructed. The thing with the relationship between, the difference between the modern Westphalian kind of history and the post-colonial, decolonial history that goes back is that they share something which is what deep history is actually questioning. It's a focus on the civilizational history. It's a history that we actually know through city civilizations where there are textual and sign evidence through which you can read. There are administrative systems, and it's as if history is told through the rise and fall of cities and civilizations. This is a well-known thing that happens all the time, and both share that. So it's a civilizational history that is not so different. It might be a different history, but it's one that's embedded in civilizations. Therefore, it shares a certain method, based on a certain methodology of doing history, according to this approach, is a history is very often told through relying on texts and stories that are known, written down, or reconstructed through certain signs. So it's a history about human texts. And of course, you can see where this goes to as the breaking point that they make by talking about a long history. There are no texts 8 million years ago, let alone 100,000 years ago. So you have a different methodology of working through the construction of whether it's human life, animal life, and so on. And it doesn't work through a civilizational context. It works much more through a kind of where, humans are not necessarily purely exceptional, although some of the history is about humans, but they are tied in with animals, with geological kind of things. So sometimes they say we don't do the history horizontally, we do it vertically because we have to dig in different layers of the earth and so on. It's a different methodology. So you can see that at work as well as a difference within history, but also, for example, in anthropology, between, on the one hand, the cultural anthropologist who retain the element about thinking in cultural communities, for example, and so on, and need this kind of, and they focus on the human exceptionalism very often, the human as the center of it. And then once you go back, to let's say before 5,000, 6,000, before Christ, right? Then the biological anthropologist takes over. And they are seen as not doing kind of history, to the textual, but they basically have a scientific method to actually recovering and telling history. And so what they do is, therefore you see the singularity and the specificity of much of the cultural social history that is being told, and how it is invested in a civilizational kind of history that is there. It's also a very strongly human-centered history on top of it. So it's about the human exception. It's the humans in, and often these things, and they come where gradually over time, it's human who emancipate from nature. Govern nature, you get ever more culture. It's a cultural kind of history that is taking place, for example. So you have these elements about certain forms of sophisticated or crude cultural evolutions that are taking place. And so the deep history moment does somehow problematize this by bringing these bits in. The other thing that it raises, because you go further back, is not just because it's further back, but it foregrounds the value, not just of reading history through material traces, or through DNA traces, or soil layers, but it also has an element about the entangling, therefore, of the geological, atmospheric, plant elements, animals, humans. So humans are in nature. And that's not something new, because to some extent through the Darwinian history, humans became part of nature. But that bit was very strongly resisted by keeping the separation between cultural anthropology, for example, and biological anthropology, which is often set on different timelines in an evolutionary element. So, but when you do deep history, you could do the deep history method for yesterday, if you want to some extent, because you work much more into the way, changes in soil, plants, and environment and the humans and the elements are connected, in a way, and to how that happens. That's the argument they make around that is important, so it speaks to the multi-species, to the material organic kind of connection, and is done over a longer term, but there is also a different method. So it's not a hermeneutic method of reading culture, right? But it's a different one to which you combine these things. Now, why is that important? I don't know. I think it's important because it raises questions about how history is actually emerging and what this does and how it comes about. Some of this discussion is indeed about dealing with the question of the human exceptionalism, or the humans as being central to history, which is central to how we do history, right, over time, by shifting the time horizon, but also the methods. So I think that's what they bring to the table. And therefore, I do think they are actually quite challenging, because they actually raise, in my mind at least, the question, how comes I have always been historicized, myself, but also the stories I get, through civilizational moments. My history was about, the Egyptians, the Greeks, they were all civilizations. The Romans, the Dark Ages were also civilization, and so the European history that I get is a civilizational one. And there is a question for the post-colonial, decolonial, that it reinscribes a world history that actually is also a civilizational one. And then there is other people who start writing about this, which work within the human exceptionalism and so on, like James Scott, who actually makes an argument that the deep history is useful because what you start realizing is that the whole bunch, even if you focus on the humans, are written out of history. Not because they are from areas, that are not from Europe, but because they had no writing, no administration, and were not in the cities, or the elements of the cities, which generally are represented in history, in the human history of the civilization, as the barbarians who are outside. They are the ones who were still moving around and doing their stuff, right? While actually all the things that mattered happened in the city kind of structures that are there. Part of that comes through the method. Part comes because there's no such a great access in history as a discipline to these, because you need to go through material, because they have no written, many of them have no written kind of leftovers, or it's spread out and dissolves somehow because they're not concentrated in the remaining cities. So it opens up a set of questions about who is included in the history and who is not included in the history, and how we reproduce, in that book by James Scott, is how we reproduce not just the civilizational history, but also one of a sedentarism, that human beings are rooted in place rather than moving through place all the time, right? Well, many people move through place. It's not an exceptionality that takes place, but somehow, so there are elements that work in this relation. The other bit that they have is, of course, when you actually do the multi-species, the entangling with nature, you're in nature, which means you're in the soil, related, the shifting of soil, the shifting of water, the shifting of weather patterns, and so on. They're all part with the plants and so on that you're in. That means that you somehow start shifting. What they see is how the discipline of history is dominated by the dominance of culture, the interesting culture over nature, cultivation over subsistence, and civilization over habitation. Now, if you work with others, you can actually work through the habitation that happens in relation to the environment within. The subsistence becomes central to the history, not the emancipation, and not the cultivation, but the very subsistence about being around and using resources and being entangled with the resources. So you get different histories, different things that are important. So that was one element that I thought that some of the elements that deep history does. There was another interesting thing in the chapter, so this is a different point. I forgot to keep track of time. Was it okay?
Keep going.
Yeah? So there was a second point that I picked up from the chapter, which is where they claim, interestingly, that's a different thing. This is about how one opens up global histories towards, ever including more voices and agency of those who have forgotten. The subaltern stands as a signifier for this. So to get rid of, the asymmetrically empowering of what they called the white, male, Western, heteronormative political actors. They had agency, so how do you deal with them? You say, well, we deal with them by giving others, by empowering others who are not included in this category. And they're important for the history. So you do more agency. But I thought that was an interesting statement, because if you look in the entanglement and so on, in the multi-species thing, about all be together and so on, why don't we make a move that the white normative blah 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 has no agency? They're not in control. Because they're also subjugated to all these processes. So you have a longer-term continuous process within which you are embedded. So the question of agency moves to the background. It's actually not important. So you take agency away rather than giving the voiceless a voice and agency. So that's it, and it comes with the method of how the history is told through the natural, the entangling with the nature, the embedding within it, because of the methods they use and the longer stretch through which they come. Which I think is, I mean, it's quite provocative for me, but I think it is quite an interesting idea that comes and is tied in with how you do history. I have one more bit here, but I think I'll leave that, because I also want, so that's the point about deep, and I thought it would raise some issues about what it means to do time. I'm not working with amnesia, but you can see there is a lot of forgetting here. Of not forgetting, but not being there, basically, right? And I wanted to also think about how time and history is a rendition of time. So history is a discipline of doing things and a mode of doing things. So it's not just there is a history, a physical history out there. And the last bit I wanted to raise, I don't know whether that will help. That was from another author. This is not deep history anymore. When I was reading Rovelli, who's a quantum physicist, gravitational quantum, on the order of time, what was fascinating in reading it is there is no time. There's no physical time, because there's only gravitation and space for them. So, but of course he wants time at some point. So where is time? Time is in memory. But that means that we have not history, but we have memory. And so therefore, time is not in history, but time is always in the present or the contemporary, because that's where the memory is. And so therefore, there is no time, in the sense, except in the memory that's on. And then the question I was thinking, I haven't thought it through, is what if we forget about history, but talk about memory? And is that different in it? Because then you're always in the contemporary, right? The past comes back, but in the contemporary, as a story. So it never exists as on a linear or less linear or whatever confluent kind of set of lines. And so I thought I was in, if we're talking about time, to talk about that actually maybe the core term is not time as such, but it's memory in a way. So that's different from the deep history kind of things. So I just took two sources to raise some questions about it, which I hope would provoke a bit of debate at some point, and disagreement possibly too, in it. But for me that's interesting, because if there is no time, only memory, that actually relates to actually how you understand the relationship between past, present and future as always being in the contemporary. So you're always somehow in the present, but we also know that we are in the present, but never in the present. So it raises elements, and then how do you deal with that? Not by telling histories that they existed, but the histories become articulations, writings, stories, movies that have much more to do with and work through memory. That's how I read his work in the end. There's only memory. There is no history and no time. I mean, there is time in memory, but it exists only through the memory. I'll leave it at that. That's where I got to with the title.
This one's better.
It's better, you don't have to hold it.
Yeah, it's better.
So I'm going to do something very different. I want to talk more about things that are actively forgotten and silenced, and why it matters. And
of course, the benefit of being the second is I can already kind of think about what Jef said and maybe upfront saying, though I really follow it intellectually, I have to say I have some real discomfort with some of it in the actual political practice, because what does it actually mean to say, well, what if the white man has no agency? Again, I follow you intellectually, but you know, it's a context, a political context of violence where, you know, the white man actively silences and exercises violence against oppressed others. And someone profits, someone always profits. You know, from the history that is written out, someone profits. It's not just because there is no access or focus on cities or methods, there is someone actually profiting. I'm just saying this is a provocation already, right? But as I said, intellectually it makes complete sense. Right, so how do I go in? Well, as those of you who did the course already know, I'm interested in process of colonization, decolonization, decolonial thought, indigenous thought. And if you deal with indigenous thought, one question always really comes up very strongly. Who are you? What is your place? Where are you from? Why are you here? So I thought I want to offer two interventions here, and just two provocations. One is maybe more provocative than the other, and how they relate, I think, to colonial amnesia. Where am I? I'm in Rio de Janeiro. I've been to Ipanema Beach. I know, and I will pronounce all the words very wrongly, so I apologize, that there's this idea of calling the people who live here, who come from here, Carioca. I've also for famous other places that I could not visit because I'm here most of the time. You know, the Lapa Arches, Maracanã. Millions of people arrive here and visit these sites every year. Most, including me, don't know that the names of these places have indigenous roots, or were built through indigenous slave labor. Lots of you probably know. I don't know what you know, but and again, this is based on quite superficial research. I'm very happy to be correct with any of what I'm saying. But this occurred to me because I had this conversation with Pedro when we were walking through parts of Rio, that when I'm in the US, when in Canada, we do land acknowledgements because of this real presence of indigenous scholars now, you know, and this real idea of settler colonialism. So when you're at ISA in North America, you will have a slide up there acknowledging where the land is from. And that's how you start. There's lots of controversy around this. Is this just a tokenist gesture that has no material implications? But Pedro was saying, well, why don't we actually do that here? Why don't we do that here? So I just thought I'd dig a little bit into this, though it's, as I said, very, very, very superficial. The Church of Our Lady of Glory of Outeiro was built on Tupinamba indigenous territory, disputed by the French and Portuguese colonizers and indigenous peoples during the reconquest battles of the 16th century. At the foot of the church sat a Tupinamba village, called Carioca, where the word actually is coming from. The Lapa arches were built in the 17th and 18th century to support the Carioca aqueduct, to bring water to the city, built by indigenous slaves. And I found this researcher in social memory, Ana Paula da Silva, who said, today we don't have that memory, all that history in books, in the media, nobody tells this story. There isn't even a sign on the monument saying any of that. Right? And she says, education, history, science, indigenous presence. It doesn't see it as part of Brazilian history, of its society. She says people have become naturalized not to see indigenous peoples. So here's my land acknowledgement. Well, I don't feel comfortable enough to say whom it actually belonged to, and I think it's probably quite comforting. We are sitting on stolen land. We are sitting on stolen and enslaved bodies of the Tupinamba and other indigenous peoples who we have killed, dispossessed and silenced, and whom we continue to kill, dispossess and silence. That's amnesia. So my second provocation. Who are you? I am German, originally. And we are people with a strong settler colonial history. No one talks about it. If colonialism enters the German consciousness at all, it's now, and that's very recent, in relation to when the German states in the late 19th and early 20th century had colonies, mainly associated with Africa. We have a long history of settler colonialism in the Americas. We had large immigration flows, mostly to the US, but also to Latin America. And there's a really famous German historian called Sebastian Konrad, who dug into this a lot, and he's part of the Global History Project. So the idea we need to get away in history from the nation-centric idea, like Germany as a nation, so we're looking at what happened after 1872 when Germany became a nation state, and much more the transnational connections that go back a long time. So in the late 19th century, Germany got a bit worried about the large immigration to the US. And the reason was that there was this real worry that they would lose their Germanness because they became assimilated, became Americans. And that was the time of world politics, imperial ambitions, where it was about getting a place in the world, establishing trade, also having colonial imperial ambitions. They tried to promote immigration to Africa, but it didn't really work, it remained really small. But South America was more successful. The idea was in South America, in Latin America, they would have more, they would be able to preserve their Germanness. They would be bearers of German culture. And the Brazilian government actually actively encouraged that. So they paid, they made it really easy to become Brazilian citizens, and it was part of the Brazilian project of white making Brazil a white nation. So there are already lots of interesting connections emerged. And again, maybe you as people nodding are more aware of that than my own country is. I don't think my country is aware of that at all. So Brazil had the largest German settler immigration in Latin America. By 1930, 200,000 Germans had emigrated to Brazil. And it was very concentrated in the south, Santa Catarina, Paraná, and Rio Grande do Sul. So what I thought interesting is how basically the German press and German, travel writers, books, particularly like the way they perceived this immigration, what's happening place in Brazil, how they promoted it, and how they made sense of it. And also how, obviously, Germans in Brazil made sense of that. And to think about what they thought made them distinct compared to others. And German settler identity became organized around work. So they said Brazilians are lazy, Spanish are lazy, French are lazy, not just the Brazilians, all of them were lazy. The Brits were just interested in trade and finance. Who else were we? The Americans were just like imperialists. We work with our hands. Work was very much agricultural labor. And in this idea of they being the ones who toil, the ones who work hard, lots of German stereotypes in there, right, of the hard-working people. Obviously, all the colonial tropes came in. Clearing the jungle, overcoming nature, empty nature without people, taming the tropical forest, making soil cultivable, populating empty land. And in all of that, as the German man bringing culture. And this goes back to a really long history of German fantasies about Latin America. Much earlier than the 19th century, there was kind of this feeling like we left out, we don't have colonies, everyone else is getting a piece, but we don't. And there's this long, again, literature has particularly this long history of developing these fantasies. If only we were there, we would be the better colonizer, the moral colonizer, the one treating the natives really well, again, bringing out German ethics and culture. And one person who was very much revered in this, and who is still incredibly revered in Germany today, is Alexander von Humboldt, who came as the sort of non-conquest Columbus, the discoverer, the one interested in nature, the one interested in science, just wanted to knowledge gaining. A few weeks ago, I was in the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, which is a very controversial museum, because it is absolutely fascinating. They took down the Palace of the Republic, which was one of the landmarks of Eastern Germany, socialist Eastern Germany. Totally ugly building, but it was a really significant piece in the culture of the Eastern German Republic. Took it down with the aim of rebuilding the palace of Wilhelm, of the emperor, which they actually did, but new politicians came in, and we now have this really weird structure of a place which is utterly modern on the one side, hyper-modern architecture, combined with this really completely rebuilt palace. There was nothing left of it, it's literally just all artificial. And it's called the Humboldt Forum. And at the bottom you have this exhibition of some awareness of maybe it wasn't all benign, Humboldt also had colonial ideas, but still this kind of reverence for this man. His peaceful conquest, not on violence. And I think all of that you can see earlier on already as well. Also the idea Germans don't hold slaves, because slaves make people lazy. Germans weren't lazy. Not true. Germans held slaves in Brazil. But again, completely not part of the general history, neither at the time nor let alone today. As the selfless, long-term orientated, not exploitative, creating, developing, being productive, all of these fantasies came in. And then some fantasies are very familiar came in as well, which was about the Teuton legends, the one where regeneration in Brazil, the German could regenerate himself. Wouldn't be degenerate like in the metropole, like in their own home country. So, you know, obviously very strong idea of the Völkisch, the sort of what the Nazis as well coming in. Why am I telling you all this? When I was writing all of this down, I'm like, I'm interested in this, but I don't know whether you are, you know, you're not, I mean, I'm reckoning most of you are not German. And so how does this link maybe to these discussions here? So, I mean, I think for me, and I was saying this to participants in my course before, for me, it was really important to actually think about my own place. And again, really bringing myself as a researcher into my research as the person I am, what shaped me and formed me. And wanting to make an intervention that relates to that. And kind of what I want to do is a much bigger project, it's only in the beginning, is really bringing it home to my own people, that they were absolutely involved in indigenous genocide, in colonialism of the Americas, in settlement, and in slavery. All of these things. And I'm also interested, but here I'm really swimming now because I haven't done research into this. These ideas of the moralizing and the more peaceful, the better, I think are really still very strong in Germany today when it comes to foreign policy. You know, I mean, even with Ukraine, with a very strong sense of moralizing going on. Maybe you have it everywhere, but I feel like there's something specific how this plays out in Germany. But then maybe the last question I want to ask here is like, you know, again, this is very specific. How does it link up to a more complex global picture, to more general histories, to connected histories? Bring in this, you know, this history approach of connected histories, where we actively revitalize forgotten, silenced histories and bring them and connect them to the dominant histories. But, you know, I think a lot of, and now I'm sort of maybe rambling a bit, but a lot of, you know, colonialism is a very hot topic in the academy in IR at the moment. You know, it's very, very popular. But it is often very much based on very superficial understandings and Anglo-centric understandings of imperialism and colonialism. So we jump, because we like the general, very quickly to like big conclusions about colonialism from these very specific contexts and with these very specific theories and paradigms. So I guess that's what I challenge a bit. I think we need to become specific. And how do we do this? But then how do we connect it as well? All these connected histories. Because there's something larger going on as well. It's not just specific. Anyway, I'll end here.
Before I begin, I just want to say how grateful I am to be here. I love coming every year. I'm thankful to João for inviting me and for Claudia for helping with the arrangements. I've been coming to teach since 2007, and several of my students from the first class are now academics teaching here and there. So I'm very moved about being here. The origin of my remarks begins a few years ago. A lot of what I read, I learn about by reading obituaries. I read about the obituary of an Argentine poet named Juan Gilman some years ago. Juan and his family were victims of the Argentine Dirty War. He ended up as an exile. His son and his daughter-in-law were murdered, and his granddaughter was shipped off to Uruguay. He ultimately found his granddaughter and reunited with her. But anyway, after I read the obituary and about his life, I bought one of his poetry books, and there's a line from one of his poems that's hard for me to say because it chokes me up. I sip the night slowly, knowing that you're in it somewhere. Anyway, in response to my interest in Gilmore and some others, I put together an essay I called The Civic Lives of Grief. And the remarks I'm going to make begin with the concept of grief and end up with the concept of amnesia, which I suggested for our conversation. I'll just give you the beginning. As Henri Bergson instructs us, people are durational subjects whose perceptions are shaped by accumulated memories. As a result, the apprehension of events is suffused with recollection, quoted as recollection of memory that link instants to each other and interpolate the past into the present. Here I'm actually talking about Deleuze's take on Bergson. Crucially as well, and this is important for my approach, Stephanie Fischel reminds us we are bodies, but we're often unaware of how corporality matters. Noting the effects of that corporality on consciousness, Bill Conley refers to, quote, the role of affect in perception and thought, and adds complexity to the memory-recollection relationship. I won't read the one. Taken together, these instructions tell us that recollection gains affective density, a concept here, over time, because an essential part of embodiment is the capacity to be affected and to affect others. The composer-vocalist Ray Charles effectively acknowledges that observation, remarking that affective density increasingly manifests itself in a singer's voice. Quote, singers don't reach their full potential until 50 because a whole life shows up in that voice. Expressed similarly, but in a different affect, different artistic genre, the painter Francis Bacon attests to it as well. Asked why he didn't start painting full-time until quite late, he said, I couldn't. When I was young, I didn't, in a sense, have a real subject. It's through my life knowing other people that a subject has really grown. Although it's evident that accumulated experiences create a fuller embodied archive from which creative work can draw, there's a sense in which a young person's relatively small archive can also be an asset for critical interpretation. Describing what he refers to as the uncluttered mind of young persons, the stand-up comedian Stephen Wright says, quote, a kid's like an alien who just got off a spaceship and is looking around. His implication is that because young people have yet to build a deep reservoir of experience, they're less afflicted by recollections that invade perception and are thus unable to see things in new ways. That exception noted, many of my pedagogical experiences speak to the importance of affective density, and I'll describe the situation. I often teach a film class at the University of Hawaii, and there's a program by which elderly people known as kapunas in Hawaii can attend along with the students. When I show a film that has strong emotional resonances and the lights go on, only I and the other kapuna show evidences of having wept. Why? Because of the affective density, all the things we've experienced. Because those pedagogical moments dividing the film reception of my viewing audience has enabled me to appreciate how prolonged grief, my own as well as that of others, can be a vital interpretive resource that attunes me to what we're experiencing. I was intrigued when I read very recently, and that's why I decided to write this essay, that the American Psychiatric Association has decided that prolonged grief is a disorder. That obviously has business implications. That means you can get paid by insurance companies for counseling people with prolonged grief. My argument is that prolonged grief is an asset. And throughout most of this paper, what I talk about is the way in which Juan Gelman, and another exile from a dirty war, Ariel Dorfman from Chile, have created productive poetic responses to their grief rather than regarding it as a disorder. I'm going to skip up the long Gelman statement section. I want to say something about Dorfman. Dorfman escaped state terror, regarded his writing genre as a way to stage vicarious events of both memory and history in support of those who've been silenced. As he puts it in the acknowledgments in the afterword of his play Windows, I was writing on a painful series of poems about missing men and women snatched from their homes by the secret police in the silence of the night, are never heard from again, the bodies denied to their relatives as if they never existed. As I wrote, I could feel myself being turned into a bridge through which the living and the dead were trying to communicate, a burial mound where they could meet and mourn in touch. The bridge metaphor with which Dorfman connects the living with the dead also serves to connect his aesthetics with an ethics. In his plays, we observe characters whose traumatic memories are hidden through traumatically imposed amnesia in the case of victims, and officially through a national amnesia involving an erasure of parts of state history, actively enacted by perpetrators and passively welcomed by their supporters. What emerges in Dorfman's counter-historical challenges is a universalistic ethos. The issues they raise transcend particular nation-state experiences. Their focus is on intersecting temporalities, national times and biographical times, especially as they articulate the complex entanglements between memory and history. Heeding Pierre Nora's insight, is one of the most important people writing about the relationship between memory and history. Memory is a dialectic of remembering and forgetting, unconscious of its successive deformations, vulnerable to manipulation and appropriation, susceptible to being dormant and periodically revived. And his dictum that history involves the conquest and eradication of memory. The ethical questions surrounding that intersection are about individual and official responsibility to acknowledge and to restore the memories of people whose experience of suffering have not been granted a sufficient place in public history. Okay, I'm going to jump to the end of my essay because I discovered a very important book about amnesia. Georgi Gospodinov, a Bulgarian, wrote something called Time Shelter. It just won the International Booker Prize. It's a delightful read. He's got a terrific sense of humor. But anyway, the main character in it is a man named Gaustin. He's a geriatric psychiatrist. And he decides he's going to treat people with dementia by creating an institute where, for example, someone who with dementia who can only make sense of the 1960s goes into the 60s section. It's got the music, it's got the other cultural things, it makes them comfortable. There's a section for people who can only deal with the 70s or the 50s and so forth. Gaustin's experiment, I'll read this because it's complicated, becomes ripe for transmutation to forms of collective national amnesia. In countries motivated to dwell on happy times and to erase disturbing or inconvenient pasts. The shelters, initially designed to accommodate individual memory loss, provide a template for places of collective historical erasure. There's an intermediate step as Gaustin's clinical practice undergoes geographic expansion. Adjunct time shelters, rooms and houses of the past begin popping up in various places. And this is an actual one I've visited. There's a place called Den Gamle By, the old town in Aarhus in Norway, in Denmark. And they reserve special times for people with dementia to make them comfortable. They come and they visit particular places that are no longer available to them. As Gaustin's temporal practice expands and gets widespread publicity, the novel's allegorical intention, that's a Walter Benjamin concept, is realized, individual dementia is translated into willful collective amnesia. Having decided to emulate the time sheltering applied to individuals for collectives, countries begin holding referendums to plot futures based on preferred pasts, or what they regard as happy times. Each nation chooses a past decade as the paradigm for freezing the national community in time. As the process unfolds, political parties compete to promote some decades and to discard others. For example, France and Spain choose the 1980s, Portugal the 1970s. To the extent that there remains a possibility of a united Europe, temporal alliances would form, while further down the line, it would be possible to vote for a unified European time. The main consequence is one of losing decades, a massive erasure of much of European history. As the headlines in a European newspaper banner, total recall, Europe chooses its past, Godspinoff figures the consequence of the historical moment he invents with her temporal retreat from elderly dementia to infancy. Quote, people didn't stop to think that in and of itself, the nation was a bawling historical infant masquerading as a biblical patriarch. And a lot of great phrases throughout the novel. Although it's evident that Gospinoff has contemporary issues in mind, for example, the impact of Brexit on European unity, more central to the novel's critical reflections is the prolonged grief associated with losing relationships. When people with whom you've shared a common past leave, they take half of it with them. Actually, they take the whole thing, since there's no such thing as half a past. It's as if you've torn a page in half lengthwise and you're reading the lines only in the middle and the other person is reading the ends. While the collective amnesia that concerns Gospinoff is more focused on the displacement of history with ersatz memory than on the erasure of violence from state terror in the countries with which Yellman and Dorfman were exiled, he nevertheless regards one of the collective amnesia consequences as a distraction from some of the contemporary forms of violence. He expresses that concern in the voice of his narrator, who's reflecting on the pervasiveness of time sheltering. Quote, one afternoon, after yet another terror attack somewhere in Europe, I spent hours in a museum at The Hague, as if in a shelter from another time. It was full of people who'd run away from the news of the day. I was standing in front of Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. I was a step away from them, not moving, their faces one and the same. So time is merely a piece of clothing, an earring. The gallery guard resembled Vermeer. To close provisionally, much remains to be thought. I want to reemphasize the role of psychiatry, that one that begins in the novel as an application of geriatric therapy, but then becomes an instance of what I refer to elsewhere as psychiatry's imperial ambitions. In this case, the ambition is on a global scale. In the words of the narrator describing the effect of the expansion of Goldstein's project, the world had become a chaotic, open-air clinic of the past. Certainly, there are enigmas involved in Gospinoff's allegorical intention. For example, one can ask about the full slate of consequences of a country's erasures of parts of its past. That question evokes the problem of reading. Gospinoff's turn to allegory as textual performance encourages a productive reading performance because he supplies no definitive or wholly satisfactory answers to a reader's interrogations. Experiencing the way his text thinks, we're enjoying to keep thinking. Stop.
Thank you, Jef, Doerthe, and Mike. I think there are some very interesting points here for discussion. Jef removing the centrality of human history to think about Greek history and its consequences for, well, lots of things. The place of time in our notions of politics and the relevance of thinking historically. So that's some very provocative notions here. Doerthe reminding us of connected histories, right, that connect, well, Germans and Brazilians with the peoples that we keep forgetting that lived in our own cities. Mike reminding us how important accumulated memories are, right? For what he calls the effective density of time that are materialized in our bodies, in our experiences. So all of our guests talk about memories, forgetting, amnesias, and how these are relevant for us to think about present violences, injustices, but also possibilities, I think. Think about our living together in the world, I think, yeah, and in different temporalities. But anyway, I won't delve too much longer in the interventions of our guests. I think I'll give the floor the opportunity to intervene and make questions. It's open.
If there's a question for me, this is the microphone I have to use.
Is it on? It's on?
It's on, yeah. Yes.
Hello, my name is Eduarda, and I'm from IRI, and I'd like to ask you all first, thank you for your exposition. It was very engaging, and I would like to know what you think about which kind of care, which kind of detail or attention to detail we have to have in mind when we are examining archives, examining documents and things that are from the past, and what we need to do if you want to give a new perspective, have a new perspective on things that are kind of hidden, kind of placed in a very specific time. So thank you.
Thank you. We can take a couple of more questions.
Are you able to hear me? Okay. So thank you very much. Everyone's intervention was great. I'm Julia. I used to study here as a graduate student and as an undergraduate student. And back then, my object of study was image, and more specifically on war images and the suffering of people, on how we make memory about entire countries and their identities through what we get to see about how some specific political events happen. And I don't know, I would like to hear Mike Shapiro on that, also everyone else's, but most specifically him, because he was like a great part of my bibliography back then. I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Okay.
Thank you all for the great talks.
Just a word of advice, whoever uses my microphone, don't squeeze it, just hold it in front of you. I'm reminded of the grocer who says, don't squeeze the bananas.
Okay. It's a question mostly for Doerthe on the lack of acknowledgement of indigenous lands and that we see names, and this is something that as I started engaging with international academia, I was also wondering, like, why don't we do this here? And I kept thinking about how Brazil is not most of the times constructed as a settler colony or with some element of colonialism. And I kept thinking whether the mentality of the state or the nation state also has something to do with that, because the way I think it often works in a very simplistic terms is, that's Brazil, that's the state in the global south, therefore colonized, not colonizer. So I think it's also, the whole binarisms in IR that are always, we're always trying to fight. So and also I think that's in a way how the international also affects the local on these transversal lines, because I see it looks like this sort of erasure to a great extent is very often sustained on this by this international difference and this positioning on the global south in a very simplistic term. And that also made me think about the violence behind the formation of nations and the homogeneity, because then you had Brazil formed as a homogeneous nation by erasing this indigenous nations, and also to which extent that took place in Europe as well. If you think about all the languages that were suppressed in the national states in Europe, in Britannia, in France, or Patois. I just these different intersecting lines and how, what do you think of? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we can give the word back to our panelists. Would like to begin? Jef? Yes?
I have no questions.
You have no questions? I think there was a question for everybody.
Yeah, no, guys, I can do that later.
Okay.
Put it on. This question gives me a chance to deal with another section of my essay. I'm really glad you asked it, because I have a lot to say about genre. Observing Gelman's poetic responses to his grief opens a space for analyzing why poetics is an especially productive way to give grief, the grief that the state terror causes, the civic impact that its publicity can render. And I turn to a text called Grief. It's about the biography of a photograph, and I'll give the details. David Schneer's biography of the Kirsch atrocity, where a bunch of Jews were murdered and dumped in a trench, and some of the bodies wouldn't fit in the trench, so they're all over the ground. And the photograph is a picture of mothers trying to identify their children. That's the famous photograph by Dimitri Waltermans. Referring to the effect of the photographer, Schneer writes, Waltermans left Kirsch a changed person, one who used his photographic skills to tell a horror story, an approach to trauma and suffering. Photography, like many other media genres, has a marked effect on others. It moves grief into public space, where its implications become subject to public negotiation. As a result of his photographic work, the photographer was doubtless not the only person changed. However, there's another character who viewed the scene that's more important to me under the circumstances. Another witness to the scene, a Soviet soldier named Ilya Savinsky, saw the anti-tank trench firsthand as he accompanied the troops liberating the city. Recording the experience in his diary, he reports the following. I got to Kirsch with the second wave of airborne troops. The city is half destroyed, that's that, we'll restore it. But near the village of Bagarov is an anti-tank ditch where 7,000 executed women, children, and old men and others. And I saw them. Now I do not have the strength to write about it in prose. This is the part that grabbed me. Nerves can no longer react. What I could, I have expressed in verse. And let me say something about that. As for the poem, it's composed as a declaration on the value of witnessing versus hearsay. It's possible to ignore gossip or to distrust stories, but I saw it with my own eyes, he said. I saw it myself. My analysis. Savinsky's resort to poetry reveals something significant about poetry as a genre, faced with what the painter Francis Bacon famously refers to as the brutality of fact. Savinsky chose a mode of expression that privileges how he was affected by the facts on the ground. Having evoked Bacon, let me just say this briefly. I want to linger briefly with his genre sentiments because they suggest a relevant transversality between painting to poetry. Bacon introduces his famous expression, the brutality of fact, in an interview in which he describes the difference he observes between Picasso and Matisse. I much prefer Picasso because he has the brutality of fact compared to Matisse. Picasso is able very often to bring over the rawness of life at the very acute point. When I talk about the brutality of fact in Picasso in a curious way was able to put it across more directly with Lex expressionism. It seemed to be the fact itself, the will to express it. It's not a hidden brutality. For example, the way capitalism sustains a vast ignorance of social realities with care and brutality, but a direct experience that cannot be conjured away with disingenuous narratives. I'll stop.
Okay, so to engage with the question about settler colonialism, well, I guess when I was writing this, I was actually thinking, first of all, you don't really need whether Brazil was a settler colony or not. It doesn't really matter for land acknowledgement because it's pretty obvious that the land, was taken away, that indigenous people were dispossessed. So that's interesting because, yeah, it always only happens in states that sort of acknowledge the settler or are classified as settler colonies, but there's actually no reason why it should be confined to that. And the second thought is, and I think I might have said it in the classes, but there is this really interesting new literature that brings settler colonial theory to Latin America. And I'm just a bit swimming with Brazil because I'm not really familiar enough with it. I haven't done so much reading on that, but some of the arguments are basically, well, it doesn't mean that you have to, again, as you're saying, this nation-centered focus doesn't mean to declare the whole nation a settler colony. But what about process of settlement and the logics that were underlying that, And one thing I just really briefly looked it up was about the Jesuits and when they basically, basically trying to civilize the indigenous people with these processes of like this kind of saying, kill the Indian, save the man. And basically again this idea of indigenous people as without any history and culture, and so they can be saved as people, but their culture is null and void, and you have to basically drive it out of them. I mean, all of these are part of the logic of elimination that in settler colonial theory is the central one. The elimination doesn't mean physical elimination only, but also the cultural, the political elimination. And then, there's lots of other interesting things on that. I know it better with Argentina, where some people argue they became settler colonial after the end of colonialism, because basically they once started to emulate the US and particular strategies in the US. Then the whitening projects, both Brazil and Argentina had that, this sort of becoming white, and various strategies to ensure the population becomes white. And so I think again, it's not about now getting so hooked up on this idea, is Brazil a settler colony or not, but what of certain ideas and frameworks helps us to understand and address what is going on. I think that's a crucial thing to do. With the archive, it's interesting. I think I would need to know a little bit more what you mean by the question, like what you mean with care. I mean, I guess if it's about engaging with subjugated knowledges, histories, forgotten science histories of the minorities, of the ones without voices, and extra care that has been taken. Is that where this question was going, or just any archival?
It's a very specific type of archive, but it's mostly the dominant, the colonial ones.
and it's
Yes.
about the fine art.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't really, I can't really speak to that because it's not really what I'm doing. I know that it's talked about as, it's an issue. And of course, it's part of this that we need to get away from the dominant colonial voice, right? It's just that actually, in my own, I've done archival research really recently, again on German history, and I was actually grappling with this because I was like, I'm returning to the voice of the colonizers, which is easier, it's more accessible to me. But again, for me, my place, I felt like was just not, engaging with indigenous history. It's not even the place I live. It just felt too remote, too academic, too far away from actually being able to make an intervention. So I guess I return to the kind of colonizers' voices because, I was saying in my class as well, I was really inspired by Frank Wilderson saying, Afro-pessimist, who says, when he has white students coming to him to do something with Afro-pessimism, he says, just take your own people down. Just don't care, you don't have to deal with this, and that became really important for me, like take your own people down. So in a way, I'm not doing this. So I have returned because of my own place to colonizer voices. But it's really interesting because I was dealing with, in the archives with the German 1980s peace movement, anti-nuclear movement. And they had a huge fascination for Native Americans, particularly West Native Americans. And they brought quite a few of them over, of the American Indian movement, so real like proper activists, And I found some things in these archives where journal writing by really important Winona LaDuke, who's like a really famous, American Indian movement activist and still is very well known. And how she was writing about her fascination with the Germans are like us. She literally said that, the Germans are like the natives. Because she saw all that resistance to the nuclear weapon decisions. She was there in Germany when the place basically exploded in resistance. And so I guess this is coming to me because I was thinking, if I just take this as face value, I would just see a native saying the Germans are like us, and I'm like, well, I have to dig deeper here. Like, what is her actual voice? Because I just have a journal entry. She's still alive, so I might be able to interview her. But, was it strategic because you were talking to a particular audience with this journal article? Was it just spontaneous and effective? That's just how you felt in the moment? It was never meant to just be massively intellectualized? Or was it more real? So maybe that relates a little bit to that. How do you find the real voice? But what is the real voice? So that's kind of all I can think of.
Thank you. The reason why I waited is I wanted to use Doerthe's provocation to me to start replying to some of the questions. Do I project or do I need to shout? I project, fine. Okay, let's see where we go. So let me start by saying that history is about, of course, an invention at some point about a certain form of dwelling in the world through stories about history that you do. So history has not always been there in terms of a form of knowledge, a form of narrating, also a form of how we actually talk about ourselves and about the world, so how we dwell in the world, if you want to. So that's what the starting point is. Therefore, history is always about a narration, a knowledge, a disciplining, an imaginary, that is images that are projected, and so on. In that sense, I do not agree that deep history is just an intellectual project, and post-colonial and colonial history is not an intellectual project, exclusively. If deep history is exclusively intellectual, then the colonial history and the nation-state history is too purely an intellectual, because there's a meta discussion about history and so on. Because deep doesn't come from nowhere. It does come in an element, it's not about, it is, and in that sense I find it interesting, of course it talks on the back of a number of things. It's a discussion within the discipline of history about what kind of historical knowledge is actually valuable and being told. But it also comes on the back of the discussions about the concern with human exceptionalism and the element of the human being central to history. Now we might have different positions on this, whether that's important, but that's a real stake currently in many debates from the transhumanism to the nice ideas about how you actually try to get the culture nature divide on to deal with the environment. So this history doesn't come, it comes from many angles, but it is not just an intellectual project, as if this is, you know, the classical thing of the ivory tower. The ivory tower is never ivory. It is always open. There's always things happening and certainly. So the deep history is a particular kind of interference in history. And therefore, I do think it is not a colonial history. It's not a history told of a world history in which the colonial experience and so on, and the stories about colonial are central to how you actually tell history. It's a different one. It does not necessarily work against it, but at certain places it raises questions for it. And the questions that it raises towards this, for example, come from the idea that it somehow, some of this work tries to move away from us being always then that anything that's valuable has to be civilizational. That comes at a cost, right? Because these are particular history, particular places that are there. What matters? You can see this in all kinds of ways. You know, why do we tell always that politics comes through cities within civilizational elements, you know, around Rome and so on, and this and that? Why not just the farmers that just work on the land and have nothing to do with the not much? I mean, I don't want to separate them too much. So that was my point on it. That raises then the question, coming back to both the archive and the images. Like any history, because the history is, I mean, there's always the paradox. You talk about the past because you want to know the factual knowledge about the past, but you also know that the history about the past is not the past as a whole as it exists. So, but then if deep history is an element about the multi-species, the embedding in the nature and so on, it does raise questions about how would you make a documentary about, for example, a certain site somewhere, or how would you make a documentary about a colonial, it could be a colonial situation that's there without actually foregrounding the coloniality for it, for example. In an archive, of course, what they argue again, I mean, that's because there is also a stake here, what I can see from what I read about, of course, the attempt to break away from what I see as two forms of history. The archaeological, but not just archaeological, but the one with material traces, DNA elements, and so on. It's a scene scientific, right? And the separation from a cultural history that works with texts, archives, and documentations. So there is, what it raises is, it doesn't take away with all these questions about how do you do an archive, which voices are subjugated in the archive, which are silenced, and so on. But it also opens the question, if you would build an archive on deep history, it cannot just be text, right? It needs to include other things. We need to have fragments of bones for this, soil, and so on, that is present. So I do think it has consequences for how that is done. And now they're often disciplinarily separated. You know, if you go in an anthropology department, I can see, because you can actually have a room with the skeletons, right, of the primates, and so on. That's the biological anthropologists. You have fragments of soil, and so on there. And then you move to the other ones, which is the cultural social anthropologist, and you've got books, very often, right? I mean, I'm stereotyping the two, but if you would mix the two, what would you get, right? So there is a stake, a disciplinary knowledge stake in this, but I would say it doesn't come just as an intellectual project. Of course, it's an intellectual project in history, but it is also resonates with some things that are happening. And it would require producing different kinds of documentaries, films, and images, I think, through which you actually make this history present. Therefore, it's not a better history or a worse, but it's an interference with the social, political, disciplinary, whatever kind of intention that's being made in it. And that's why I think deep history is interesting, not because it is the better history, but it does actually put forward elements about doing it different. There are different ways of how people relate in the present to the world by doing that history, which does challenge some of the colonial history, although it also can incorporate it, but I think it would have to do it differently. So that's what I tried to get across in it.
Jef, are there More questions? Bill?
Wow. I wasn't expecting this. Thank you all for your presentations. My question relates directly to Doerthe's talk and the project on German colonialism. And it relates a lot to Kaio's previous question as well. And it has to do with, I was reflecting here, listening to you, and I think there's a strong difference between your taking down your own, right, as you described it. There's a strong difference between you doing it, taking down your own, and myself doing it, taking down my own. And the difference I see is hearing what you were saying about von Humboldt. It seems that you are uncovering a hidden history of German colonialism that you can show to fellow Germans and hold them accountable to what Germany has done in the world in the past. It is different if I do it. Because if I do it, in my attempt to holding Brazilians accountable for what Brazilians have done in the past, in doing that, I feel that in order to do that, I necessarily delegitimize the existence of Brazil as a nation. Because it is built on stolen land. We shouldn't even be here to begin with. So, my question is, in trying to frame it as a question, I guess what I get to is, what about Juncker colonialism? What about the Teutonic Knights colonialism? Like how, is there a point where, I mean, is there any way we can engage on that project without completely delegitimizing the conception of nation that embeds the nation state itself? What will be left? Like, I'm not saying like it's dangerous, we shouldn't do it. No, I think we should. Like that's the right way. But once we do it, and again, I think we should. What will be left to do politics with?
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have a question more directed to Jef. I thought that your engagement with the history was really great, and really I can clearly see the politics of that. But it also made me think of how there are different scholars engaging in order to criticize human exceptionalism with a history that goes even before deep history, which would be the geological history, or before the human species itself. And some of the projects, sometimes I'm a little bit suspicious of them because it seems that they're not political enough. I think of Mediasu's concept of the archaefossil, which is the idea that the archaefossil was there before the existence of humans, so it's the only thing that can actually escape the Kantian trap, that we can only access that through mediation of human relations to the object, because the archaefossil will be the object in itself. But in that sense, I guess, in my opinion, it's really hard to go to the political project of this entangled history that you are advocating for, which I completely agree. But then there's people like Chakrabarty or William Connolly that go to this geological time before the existence of humans in order to criticize the way we do. We think of geological time as slow and gradual in order to politicize this kind of thinking of temporality. So I was wondering if you would think how would be a political project that would also engage with the geological time that comes before, geological history that comes before deep history, and if it makes sense to include that in your thinking.
Thank you, Brianna. Você também? Yeah, here first, then.
So, hi, I'm Anna. First of all, thank you. It was a very fascinating talking. My question is actually directed at Jef. It's a very brief question. I completely agree when you said there's no physical time, there's only memory, and I'm working on this on my research. But also, Professor Rosenow, I think she cited a woman, I don't know, a person, she said, today we don't even have that memory, which set me in a spiral because I'm facing this question when looking at my research. How do we talk about time as memory when memory is absent? So I would just like to hear a little bit about this.
Hi, thank you for all your interventions. And I would like to ask all of you, thinking about today as the best of tomorrow, what would the role of us as scholars in IR to not repeat the same mistakes we did when relating to past events?
You didn't get it? Can you say it again? Sorry.
I was writing something. Sorry.
Sorry, okay. What would you say it's the role of us as IR scholars to not repeat the same mistakes we did back then when relating to past events of today, when we are talking in the future?
Anyone else? No? Okay. Who goes first?
I can go first.
You can go first.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have good answers to all these questions, but I'll do my very best to say something that sounds a bit intelligible about it. I mean, Adriana, I was thinking about this. Some of the deep history does go back, I guess, to geological time, but I think there's something interesting in it as well, in that I was going to make 2 points. One is you don't have to go back to geological time, because the geological time brings in the longer time. Now, I understand it has a bit materiality, but the way I understand what some of the people do in the deep history in this particular book that I talk from, some of them, it's really not about going before the human, because it's still a history about humans, right? So it's a history about humans because their starting point is the separation, at least in this book and in the graph they have, between the apes, and some form of what I see as a human lineage that goes on. But what they do is, into the way they research this, is that the human is not exceptional within this, but is tied in with all these other things. So you get an element, I don't know what terminology they use, I should have to reread it again specifically, but things sit together. So they're folded into one another or pressed onto one another. And therefore, the question is not a human history or a history about humans, but it's a history that breaks the human exceptionalism, as if we have to take the history about the separation from these things. Right? That's one element, I think, that they do, why I find it interesting as, partly an intellectual exercise, but also partly about what kind of question it raises in things. Second thing is that, of course, one uses geological time to make time slow. Slow in literally the sense, make it longer of what is significant. Right? It's not that we move slower, it's longer. of what you do. Some of what these people do is, they do not necessarily study long periods. Some of them, there's an interesting discussion about how you can study micro situations, which are very short, but nevertheless contain a lot of stuff about what's going on. Which also means that the long history from before, because, you know, simply because there is not enough information or one hasn't tried to do enough information, shows a lot of change within it as well. So the stretching out of these hundreds of thousands of years when seemingly nothing happens, because humans, you know, the human bodies and biology is static for a long period. It's as if we have ice ages and nothing changes in it. Suddenly you can do the micro element in this coming together. You actually see change a lot there. Now, this is a form of telling history that breaks with the way that we have, you know, the long periods of stasis, and actually anything accelerates. We just have to debate, we're going to do a new era in 1950, right? No era. So, but that's only possible because we shrink the length, and because there is this knowledge about the closer we are to who we think our time is, the more one sees change. And the past is more static all the time and frozen. And I think they interfere in that as well. And thus that's what I think, there's some interesting moves because of the way they think and work, and the methodologies they have. I mean, at some point you did not have the methodologies to do that kind of work, right? These things start shifting. And I think it's interesting because it's not without consequences about how we, if history is about our relation to the present and ourselves, then it just raises questions about it. So that was that one. On the memory, I don't know I can answer. I mean, I just did the Rovelli thing because I thought it would throw in something interesting, but there is an element in it. If there is no memory, if I'm trying to think on my feet now, if I think through with Rovelli that only time exists through memory, then there is no time. If there's no memory, there is no time. So the stake is in the memory, right? Because time is not a physical thing anymore. It's in the memory. So if you don't have memory, you have no time. In this, I'm not saying that's correct, but I mean, in that kind of logic, but to me that makes somehow sense if rather than history, memory becomes the stake when you're interested in time and temporalities, then the time exists, requires there to be memory. Because otherwise there's no time in some form. That would be the logical kind of thing. And that would be the way why memory becomes the central element of how you engage with time. Because that's the condition of possibility to have time. So that's how I actually thought this would work. I mean, could work. And I think it's quite interesting because it shifts from history to memory, which is not the same, right? And I'm sure that's probably your work partly as well, that you work to memory rather than to history as such. So that was the role of IR scholars about not making mistakes. No, they have to make mistakes. That's not possible not to make mistakes. Because the mistakes is defined by the other knowledges that say you're mistaken, and then we have a discussion, right? So in that sense. But I think the more interesting thing is to treat the different kind of elements about how history is done, how time is done, different temporalities and discussions around that, as opening up sets of debates that certain given institutionalized familiar repertoires somehow become slightly disrupted through it. And that makes it possible to talk about mistakes, but they're not necessarily mistakes, they're about differences that are there and the consequences and implications of that. That's how I read it in that way. Doesn't mean that people don't make mistakes, of course.
In response to the question about the responsibility of the IR scholar, I'm not an IR scholar, but I do talk about problems of responsibility. And I guess to the extent that I make a contribution, it's looking for historical material in places that people don't usually look. The best example of African American history that I can think of in the US is Duke Ellington's musical history of African America called Black, Brown, and Beige, in which he talks about the various elements. Fairly recently, I ran across a fantastically interesting way of doing history. There's a Cuban named Leva Novo who does history by creating black squares and putting them on the wall. The size of the square is the amount of ink that a totalitarian regime has had to use to produce a particular oppressive law. And so what he does is he materializes history with ink. Art history is another place, the canvases and so forth to look. And so I've taken it upon myself when I'm interested in history to look in places where people neglect to look.
Okay, so trying to connect a few things as well. So Pedro, this is a really interesting question. I guess it seems to rest on the assumption that the nation should not be taken down and that we need the nation for political intervention. Maybe, no, I mean, because I think, because ultimately, and maybe that's at the moment more based on intuition rather than because I'm at the beginning of this project, it hasn't actually been at its very, very early stages. Because I think somehow I want to take down the German nation. And you said maybe with Germany that's right. Is that right with Brazil? Well, I don't know. So again, maybe that's what we have to do, very concrete history of to think about what allows for the right political intervention. And actually that's where I would connect your question, or maybe coming back to the discussion between Jef and Lee, and sorry for the intellectual. It was literally a throwaway comment. It wasn't, you know, I think I meant more to say not that this is an intellectual project, but more I follow it intellectually, you know. But I guess because what political interventions do things allow us to do? That for me is a really important question. So I guess we discussed this as well, you know, decolonial thought is based on a very traditional, you might want to call it civilization history. And it's very powerful because of that. And I think it allows us to see certain things, it makes other things invisible, but does it allow political interventions? And so I guess that's what the question I would always ask. So also with maybe deep history, probably depending on the context, what political interventions does it allow us to do? And whether it allows us to do this, it probably, again, depends on the context. What problems do general theories, historiographies allow us to see, and what do they make invisible? And what can we do concretely with it? I think that for me is a really decisive thing. And maybe that also responds to the question about the mistakes, although again, I totally agree, like of course we have to make mistakes again and again and again, but this kind of move towards the actual concrete politics that things allow us to do. And that's where I am a scholar, don't know how I want to define myself intellectually, but who wants liberation, who wants to do away with the present state, you know, actually, concretely. So how do we do that? And in my class, we also talked a lot about the dismantling of the camps, you know, which I think this is, in my ideal world, where IR should go. Do away with the Marxist, post-structuralist, maybe even IPS, all of these camps, you know, and come kind of together in new ways. Because, you know, I see it at ISA, you know, we all are in our camps. Here, I felt like we're really talking cross-camp. And I think that's amazing. So that if I would make one call, that would be the call for me. And again, with this impetus of concrete politics, you know, how does it move us to concrete political interventions? Just the last point on the, I guess where my so it's coming to the nation. So it's now a lot of stuff going on in my head, but because I think my and that again it's intuitive. My discomfort with this constant identification that I saw with lots of Germans they still do in popular culture with Native Americans, comes from this history of like looking coherence for their own identity, for their own nation, in a nation that took a long time to come about. And actually that's why I found this impetus from Wilderson to say, take it down, like actually this constant attempt to rebuild this coherence of your civil society, of your nation, I somehow think that's violent, but it is very intuitive at the moment. But again, whether it's the same for Brazil, maybe not. Maybe not. And I guess the last point, again, this coming back to Jeff's point is, I guess where my discomfort was coming from, maybe that's my Foucauldian hat, putting my Foucauldian hat on, is what does an utterance like let's take away everyone's agency. You didn't say that, I'm just sort of, but let's, or what if the white man doesn't have agency and the others, what does this mean in very concrete political context? What does this do, a statement like that? And, as someone who came very much with a post-human approach and actually was in a workshop where decolonial scholars, very Campbell-like, came together with the post-humanist scholars, and I was on the post-humanist side, I guess what I found really challenging there was by saying, well, why should we move beyond, I was asked, why should we move beyond the human if the human is not even all-encompassing, if there's so many people who are not even counting as humans in the first place, So again, what is then the possible violence of this idea that we should move beyond human exceptionalism if it's not even human in the first place, because it's not all-encompassing? What is it? Why should we move beyond agency if so many people have no agency in the first place? But I get that there's problems with this as well from the historiography. I can't speak anymore. You know what I mean? From that perspective, I get it, because yes, of course you're right. It comes again from quite taken for granted historical understandings. And that brings me back to this point, but what does this do politically, potentially? And I feel like that was a lot of rambling. So I'll stop.
People can ask questions.
Yeah. And please get engaged, you can challenge us as well. Unless we're already over anyway.
We are almost out of time, unless.
You can't challenge us then.
But
Yes. Oh, that's going to be difficult.
if you have an intervention, yes, please. We'll give you time to do that. We don't want to silence anyone. Yeah. Francine, please.
Sorry. It's actually a very short question for related to something that Jack asked. So what does it mean to do time? So that's a question that I heard from you, and I was wondering if we should also, of course, it's implied a lot of your intervention. What does time do as well? And I heard you saying that time is memory, or is in memory, and then questioning the idea of existence of physical time. And then I was thinking about the future as this temporal concept as well. If the past, you didn't say that the past specifically was in memory, but time is in memory. So does that mean that future is also in memory? And then does that mean that we are doomed to keep repeating what's possible to remember? Basically, what kind of space does it leave us for imagination? Basically, that's what I was wondering when we think about memory, and not the future as something that we are moving forward in that sense, but the possibilities, right, of creating, of doing something.
I have something to say about that.
Actually, you have to go ahead.
Hang on. Anyone else besides Francine? No? Okay.
You can't really talk about time intelligently without dealing with the problem of grammar. And in my book on time, one of the grammatical things that I privilege is the future anterior. And that is, how will the past have been? So there is no past that's fixed. The past always is. The way Deleuze talks about Bergson is to say, the past is, the present was. It's always changing. There's always a way, basically, to reinvent how we understand what will have been, what has been, and therefore there's always a will have been as we renegotiate. So it's always open. But you can't do history without engaging in grammatical calisthenics.
Want to say something? Doerthe?
Yeah. Can I see?
You can.
Since you're going on about silence, I'll use the occasion to do. I mean, I was gonna, in a multiple clumsy way, I think that's why I was glad Mike wanted to answer it, because that's the answer. I think I would somehow, I inhabit too, but I couldn't formulate it in that way. That's one. But, so that answer, I wanted to come very briefly back. I mean, it's unfair to have an internal discussion, I guess, around the panel, but there is an element about, I wanted to make two things. I wanted to pick up the element why I thought, although I know it's a provocation, I'm not sure I should throw it, about this quote that I read in there, about why assigning more agency to ever, when you do empowerment, you assign agency to ever more agents, right? Who are silenced or not spoken or don't have age, are not supposed to have age. So you're right, but remember this about history writing, right? So you actually give ever more agency too. So the fact that the element about the white blah 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 thingy, construction of the subject, who is given the dominant agency, I think the project in here about the statement about why rather than multiplying agencies across categories, take away in your writing that the agential element of this particular subject category is what drives history. Because that's one of the paradoxes about being critical about the history. You do assign the power to the white blah 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 person, right? And subject. So there is an investment. I mean, it's an investment and it's formulated into Hegel and kind of stuff, but that doesn't matter. But I think there's an investment in the history of how would you write history, construct archives that are not about investing history as being driven by certain subject categories that you position as having the agency to drive the history. And just, so it opens up, I don't know how to do, I have some idea, I think, but I don't do history in that sense. So there is an element about doing the history. So it's not about I don't have history, it's about history writing. I don't have power or agency. This is about history writing, how you do it. And the second thing I wanted to say about the concrete, I forgot to answer, Adriana. To some extent, what are concrete politics? And that's the discussion we can pick up. I'm not going to do this because there's an element, what do you mean that politics are concrete? To some extent, politics for me is also about, it depends about the disruptions, the controversies, the kind of differences that are being negotiated and structured around issues. Interesse, whatever you call it. And that does not mean that the issue of deep history is not necessarily the same issue as the issue of the colonial history through which the politics. But there is a politics happening in what you can read and what I can read in here, yeah, because the history is political, because it interferes. I mean, it's a disciplinary thing, but it's also there are political stakes that are articulated in the very narrow understanding of politics as the political sphere, the negotiations that happen around things like the environment and so on, right? So it sits there too. But that's a question about what's concrete politics in this, and how do you define what makes something political? Whether it's the agency, whether it's a stake. So I thought I'd throw that in to clarify where I sit. Well, I sit here, but hey. But thank you for the questions.
Okay, good. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. This concludes then our second roundtable for the IPS Winter School. It almost concludes the IPS Winter School, but that will happen tomorrow in the afternoon. I'd like to thank very much again Mike Shapiro, Doerthe Rosenow, and Jef Huysmans for this lively discussion on time, memory, and amnesia. Thank you very much, guys. See you tomorrow.